Ready?
And good morning.
This is the Daily Aus.
This is the Daily Aus.
This is the Daily Aus.
Oh, now it makes sense.
Good morning and welcome to the Daily Aus. It's Wednesday, the 8th of April. I'm Sam Koslowski.
I'm Billi FitzSimons.
Before we get into today's podcast, we wanted to let you know that we are now actually a video podcast if you're watching us on Apple.
We are, so we can look to the cameras and say hello to everyone.
Good morning.
So you can now watch our podcast as a video on YouTube, where we have been for a couple years now,
Yep.
and on Apple, which is the new update. You might have heard at the start of this podcast, we always have our, this is the Daily Aus, this is the Daily Aus.
Oh, now it makes sense.
We have now updated that to be a video, which is very exciting. So if you want to watch the podcast as a video on Apple specifically, unfortunately it is only for iPhone users, you need to update the software on your phone. So it's not just about updating the podcast app, you actually have to update the software on your phone. But very, very exciting news to now be a video podcast.
The podcast landscape is changing and we are here for it. I do want to turn to today's topic now though. RobertsSmith has been arrested for war crimes in what will become the most significant war crimes prosecution in Australian history. Once celebrated as an Australian war hero, the allegations surrounding RobertsSmith have dominated news headlines for years. And in many ways, this is the end, but in other ways, it's actually the beginning of a 5-year investigation. The former soldier now faces life in prison. We'll tell you everything you need to know in today's deep dive. Let's get into it.
Sam, I think we should acknowledge from the outset that this is a case that has had so many twists and turns over the past couple of years, over the past 8 years.
Yeah.
Let's start with who RobertsSmith is.
So the central character of this story is a former corporal in the Special Air Service, or the SAS. He served in Afghanistan. And RobertsSmith is probably most well known for receiving the Victoria Cross, which is the highest Australian military award. And he was awarded that for acts of bravery in wartime in 2011. And so after that point, he was often referred to in public by, prime ministers, state and territory leaders, celebrities as a hero. There's a quote from former Aussie PM Malcolm Turnbull. He said, RobertsSmith is a great Australian hero. He is someone that every Australian looks up to in every respect. He was actually named Father of the Year in 2013. So after he retired from the armed forces, he then became a consultant. So he did a bunch of work with government. He was actually then appointed the general manager of Channel 7 in Queensland. So, a storied and celebrated military career, and then a transition into the private sector.
He is Australia's most well-known soldier.
Yeah.
And I think, painting the fact that prime ministers have explicitly called him a war hero really paints the scene of how famous he is. But that all changed in 2018 when allegations were published about him.
Yeah, we're talking 8 years ago, which gives you an idea of how long this has gone on for. So it all started with a series of articles. The articles were published between 2018 and as recently as 2023. And in the articles, there was the core allegation that RobertsSmith either ordered or personally carried out killings of prisoners in Afghanistan in a manner constituting war crimes.
And so the whole thing here was that he allegedly killed unarmed civilians in Afghanistan whilst representing Australia in war.
So the allegation of kind of beyond the scope of what is expected in war, there was no pretense here that death isn't a part of war, but this was about the manner of the death and who was being alleged to have been killed. And so this was an investigation done by The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Canberra Times. And it was all led by a very famous Walkley Award-winning journalist whose name is Nick McKenzie. Now, the articles also alleged that RobertsSmith punched a woman he was reportedly having an affair with in Australia. And I think it's really worth acknowledging that these allegations were uncovered by journalists at these 3 publications and then later at 60 Minutes as well. And this was a media first story. So you do get other stories where kind of police may, give some allegations a bit of airtime and then journalists do a bit of digging. This was uncovered really by the very impressive team of journalists at those publications. Now, RobertsSmith has always denied these allegations against him and he's maintained his innocence. And he maintained his innocence so much so that he actually sued those publications for defamation, essentially arguing that these publications ruined his reputation. The celebrated war legend had become, through these articles, an alleged war criminal, and Ben RobertsSmith took them to court over it.
And that became one of the most high-profile defamation cases in Australia that I can remember of the past couple decades.
Yeah, and the fascinating thing with how defamation law works in Australia, and particularly in this case, is that it essentially became a war crimes case. Because the way that all of those publications defended themselves in court was essentially by saying you can't defame somebody if what you're alleging they did was actually true. And so it became about evidence. It became about, what evidence can be uncovered by this civil court from Afghanistan. There was eyewitness testimony. It was a really interesting war case in a defamation proceedings. And essentially, he lost.
He did lose. And I want to pick up on something that you said. You said that this was a civil case. And I think that's a key thing to understand here, that whilst all of these allegations against him, or at least some of the allegations against him that came out in these initial articles, were tested in court. They were tested in a civil court where no matter the outcome, he would not have gone to jail no matter what that court found.
Yeah.
And so the court did find that the allegations against him were substantially true, which is why he lost. But even though the court found that the allegations of war crimes against him were substantially true, nothing happened in terms of whether or not he would go to jail, because you can't do that in a civil court.
Should we do a quick little recap of what you need, the burden of proof in both?
Yes.
Okay, so in a civil case, which was this case, it needs to be more likely than not that something happened.
In the defamation case.
Yes. So think about it like 51%.
Yeah.
I know it's simplistic, and I'm sure there'll be some law students and lawyers who will come at me in the comments, but essentially it's that.
Well, the good thing is you are a lawyer, a former lawyer.
Yeah, I don't know how long I can keep hanging on to that for, but yes, in a criminal case, which is what we're going to talk about in a second, that burden of proof is basically 100%.
Beyond a reasonable doubt.
So that 51% of kind of what the prosecution needed to prove in that civil case, in a case that we're going to talk about in a second, which all kind of kicked off yesterday, that's going to become 100%.
Okay, Sam, so we covered that he lost the defamation trial, but that actually wasn't the end of that defamation case.
No, it went all the way up to the High Court. So it kind of went through a whole bunch of different appeals. It was an absolute saga that would have had eye-watering legal bills attached to it. I mean, this was a really long case.
And that was because Ben RobertsSmith continued to maintain his innocence.
Exactly. And I think also it was because it was such a unique experience for the courts. I mean, this was the first time in history that any Australian court, civil or criminal, had actually assessed claims of war crimes by Australian military personnel. So the rule book here for the lawyers and for the way in which this proceeding played out was so uncertain. So it went all the way up to the High Court. The High Court eventually found that, in fact, Nine had not defamed Ben RobertsSmith.
They actually didn't even hear the case. So
Right.
the High Court refused to even hear the appeal.
That's right,
They
exactly.
said that it didn't have enough grounds for us to even hear the appeal.
And I mean, this was a case that would have had a serious financial impact on the companies that were being sued, millions and millions of dollars. It ended up having quite a significant financial impact on Ben RobertsSmith, who was ordered to pay some of the costs for those who he had tried to sue, and was obviously then kind of tainted in the public image as well.
Okay, we're going to get to the news yesterday, but first we're going to take a quick break. Okay, so that is the end of the civil case.
Yeah.
Yesterday, everything changed when the Australian Federal Police announced that they had arrested and charged Ben RobertsSmith with war crimes, which was the first time that this had happened, and it now means that it will enter the criminal court.
Yeah, I mean, let's just sit on that for a second. I mean, we are talking about arguably Australia's most decorated soldier from the last 20 or 30 years being charged with war crimes. Only the second person ever in Australia to be charged with war crimes. This is a major case, and I wouldn't be surprised if it goes on for many years now. So the AFP announced yesterday that Ben RobertsSmith had been arrested at Sydney's domestic airport. They were on the tarmac waiting for a Qantas domestic flight to land from Brisbane. Ben RobertsSmith got off the plane and was arrested by AFP personnel. He was charged with 5 counts of war crime, including murder. And police are going to allege that when he was part of the ADF, he was involved in their words, deaths of Afghan nationals between 2009 and 2012 in circumstances that constitute war crimes. So the alleged victims were unarmed when they were allegedly killed, and it's also alleged that RobertsSmith killed these victims himself or ordered soldiers that were more junior to him to shoot the victims. And if we really just think about how this could end, Ben RobertsSmith is facing life in prison. So this is a major case.
Yeah, I feel like that's even an understatement if it can be. This is such a huge story. It's a huge story for the journalists at The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald who have worked on this for so many years. I mean, some of them have literally worked on it for half of their careers. That's how much investment has gone into this from a journalism perspective.
Totally.
You said at the start that this is probably just the beginning, and I couldn't agree more. There is now going to be so much that's going to come out about this. If there is a court trial, we will hear all of the evidence. It will all be in the open court.
Yeah.
So we will be keeping everyone updated. Sam, thank you for taking us through that.
Of course. And I think if anyone's listening or watching, it's a really important story to ask us some questions about. I mean, this is something that is going to be in the headlines now for the next couple of years, let's say. Let us know how we can help get your head around this story. It's a really significant one.
I know we spoke about people listening on Apple before, but if you are listening on Spotify, there is a section where you can put comments and we read those comments every single day. So if you do have any questions about the case, please feel free to put your questions there and we will make sure to look at them and answer them.
Love it.
And we'll be back later today with the evening headlines. But until then, we hope you have a good day.
My name is Lily Madden, and I'm a proud Aranda, Bundjalung, Kalkadoon woman from Gadigal country. The Daily Aus acknowledges that this podcast is recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people and pays respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations. We pay our respects to the First Peoples of these countries, both past and present.